Shri Naseem Ahmed, the chairperson of the National Minorities Commission, Dr. Najma Heptullah, the Honorable Minister for Minority Affairs, Shri Mukhtar Naqvi, the Minister of State for Minority Affairs and Parliamentary Affairs, Shri Amrendra Sinha, the Secretary, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me at the very outset express my gratitude to the Minorities Commission and particularly the chairperson for having invited me to deliver this year's annual lecture of the National Minorities Commission. I've seen the list of very distinguished people who have delivered the earlier 7 lectures. And I must confess at the very outset that I am significantly unequal to the task that you have assigned to me. But nonetheless, I must express my gratitude because the subject that you have chosen as the economic empowerment of the minorities in India is indeed extremely important. It's important because economic development of the country really involves a development of each and every section of Indian society. And therefore, for a group which constitutes a very large part of India's population, its economic growth really has to be to match up to our national goals and aspirations. The 2011 census has indicated that the total population of the minorities in India is about 23.4 crores, which is approximately 19.3% of India's population. Almost 38% of our 640 odd districts in the country have a significant amount of minority population. And therefore, the essence of the approach that I wish to follow in this lecture is that if India is to grow and grow significantly, the growth itself would be incomplete unless every section of the population grows. High growth rate ordinarily impacts all sections of society. It benefits some more than it benefits others. But then the impact of high growth rates is positive on most sections of Indian society. An analysis of India's socio-economic and educational growth would indicate that even amongst the minority communities, the situation is not identical. It varies from community to community. What then are the special measures which are required to bring about uniformity to the extent possible and accelerate these growths itself? I'd be dealing with this subject in several parts. And I'm sure these are essentially my individual views, which would find favor and acceptability with a large number present in this august audience. First, on the character of and the situation as it exists today. India is unusual in having an especially large number of axes of difference or cleavages. Most countries have differences based on caste, religion, and gender. But in India, the differences are along caste, religious, and linguistic lines also. Even Europe, which has many languages, has one script common to all. India has so many different scripts in addition to languages. While these differences create challenges, India's unique diversity also adds to the richness of its social, cultural, and economic life. Think of our music, literature, film, sports, public life. All communities have contributed to these walks of life. The history of economic development shows that countries that manage these differences will also manage to grow rapidly and inclusively. Social peace and inclusiveness are preconditions for successful economic development. Identity should not become the focus of conflict or targeting, or should not be exploited as a vote itself. In India, while progress has been made, poverty rates, educational rates of some minority groups needs to grow faster. For example, according to the 2011 census, amongst the major communities in India in terms of population, the total literacy rate was Hindus 73.3%, Muslims 68.5%, Christians 84.5%, and Sikhs 75.4%. Now, the same data for a similar period, if it is translated into poverty rates, that is for the year 2011-12, the rural and urban areas combined, the rate amongst the Hindus is 21.9%, Muslims a little higher, 25.4%, Christians 16.4%, Sikhs 5.9%. Even amongst the Muslims, progress has been made on reducing poverty. This community saw the biggest percentage decline in poverty rates between 1993-94 and 2011-12, from 51.2% to 25.4%, or a 25.8% point decline. The comparable decline for the Hindus was 23.7%. Education remains a key to the social and economic advancement. In 2009-10 amongst the Muslims, the poverty rate was 31.9% amongst the non-literates, but only 7.1% amongst them had a graduation degree. Government is committed to advancing the cause of the minorities and other disadvantaged groups. Philosophy of the government is to increase targeted assistance while special programs, but also to provide generalized opportunities so that all communities can benefit. Economic growth will be the key to providing opportunities. The rising tide will lift boats, and with targeted assistance, we can ensure that it lifts all boats. Education is also the key, and education for everyone, that is male and females alike. Now I pause here for a moment in order to elaborate this point. Post 1991, since the advent of economic liberalization, when our growth rates picked up, because pre-91 in the age of controlled economy, we were satisfied with a 2%, 3%, 4% growth rates. And with these growth rates where the world had broadly ridiculed us and occasionally used a phrase for India's growth rate, calling it the Hindu rate of growth, it was economic liberalization which significantly moved these rates up. And over the last 25 years, as these growth rates have increased, at times even touched 8 and 9% in terms of growth, it has led to reduction in poverty levels. It has improved education and literacy levels. And this increase has significantly impacted upon all. And therefore, the first key point to be noted is that even with the high economic growth leads to the welfare of all, Where it creates inequalities, in those areas one has to consider targeted assistance so that the groups which get left behind in that race for development itself can be pushed up on the strength of that targeted assistance itself. The other factor which comes up as a key in this statistical analysis is, amongst some of the minority communities, the Muslims for instance, the level of higher education, considering 7.1% graduates as per the 2011 data, is increasingly inadequate. And therefore, it is this one area where education really holds the key. When I speak in terms of education holding the key, I will divert a little from the principal subject and go to the position of the rights as envisaged in our constitutional system. There are some fundamental rights which are absolutely common to all, and therefore every person, majority, minority, any citizen, any person in India would certainly be entitled to his right to equality, he'd be entitled to all his fundamental freedoms, he'd be entitled to his right to life and liberty. But when we framed these laws, there was a certain amount of freedom and a particular protection in relation to minority rights, which particularly the framers and the draftspersons of the Constitution themselves have drafted. So I would, before I proceed with the main subject, just reflect on this subject in a little detail. The constitutional imperative to protect minorities flows from a recognition of India's diversity and to prevent ghettos of backwardness. The key method for recognizing and preserving such diversity was by vesting every citizen with the freedom to profess, practice and propagate his religion. That's Article 25. Further, every section of citizens, including minorities, had a right to conserve their script, culture and language, Article 29(1), establish and administer educational institutions of their choice, and to manage their own religious affairs. However, the draftspersons were careful to not create islands of diversity, but instead sought assimilation. Education was the primary focus for such assimilation. As a result, no citizen could be denied admission in a minority school that was funded by the state, and the state could not be discriminatory in the grant of any such aid. In pre-1947 discussions, the term minority, that's before independence, included not only religious and linguistic minorities, but also backward castes and tribal communities. This was not only due to their numerical weakness, but also because of their cultural distinctiveness and historical disadvantages. It was decided that in terms of political representation, backwardness was more appropriate basis for group differentiated rights. With partition, political representation for minorities was felt to be potentially divisive. Two changes occurred as a result. First, the emphasis shifted to cultural and educational rights. And second, minority protection articles were amended to focus on linguistic and religious minorities. This changed sense was manifested in the draft constitution prepared by the drafting committee. Explaining the stance taken in the draft constitution towards minority protection, Dr. Ambedkar on the 4th of November 1948, he outlined the philosophy in the following words, and I quote, "In this country, both minorities and majorities have followed a wrong path. It is wrong for majority to deny the existence of minorities. It is equally wrong for minorities to perpetuate themselves. A solution must be found which will serve a double purpose. It must recognize the existence of minorities to start with. It must also be such that it will enable majorities and minorities to merge someday into one. The solution posed by the Constituent Assembly is to be welcomed because it is a solution which serves this twofold purpose." Unquote. As a result, there was a distinct difference between minority protections in recommendations of Minorities Subcommittee and draft constitution, prepared by the constitutional advisor prior to the constitution, and the draft constitution itself discussed in the Constituent Assembly after it. In material part, draft Article 23, read as under, "Minorities in every unit shall be protected in respect of their language, script, and culture, and no laws or regulations may be enacted that may operate oppressively or prejudicially in this respect." This was replaced with the following: "Any section of citizens residing in the territory of India or any part thereof having a distinct language, script, or culture of its own shall have the right to conserve the same." Amendment to restore the previous clause was forwarded by Shri Z.H. Lahiri, a member. According to him, the former provided stronger protection against discriminatory laws and had minorities as the key focus. On 7 December 48, he argued, quote, "The reasons which have led me to move this amendment in order to restore it to its original condition can be briefly stated. Sir, I believe it is accepted on all hands that cultural and educational rights have to be protected, and this is the intention of Article 23. There can be no gainsaying on this point. The clause as it originally stood and as it is approved by the House intended to lay down that no laws, no regulation shall be passed which would adversely affect a minority in maintaining and fostering their own culture and language. That is to say, no such law shall be passed which would nullify the right, a right which being conceded by a linguistic minority. If a clause were to stand, as I have put it, and as the House originally approved, the result would be that there would be an adequate remedy at the disposal of the minority to see the intentions of this House were carried to this effect. But if you look to the language used in the draft constitution, it comes to this only, that minority or a section of citizens shall be entitled to conserve its own language. What does it mean? What is the effect? It simply means that a body of citizens shall be entitled to use their own language and in their private intercourse. This amendment was not accepted. The basis of the current Article 2930 can be traced inter alia to a certain amendment suggested by Thakurdas Bhargav, a member of the Constituent Assembly. Bhargav's key thrust was to make Article 29 not a minority protection article but a nation-building article. He wanted making the right to be non-discriminatory admission to educational institutions available to all citizens and not minorities. B, deletion of the word community from the article and making the right available to any section of citizens without discrimination on basis of race, caste, or language. And C, extended the ambit of institutions where no discrimination to be made by the state, not only to the government institutions but also to state institutions. Explaining his logic on 8 December 48, he said, quote, "Now, sir, it happens to that the words no minority seek to differentiate the minority from a majority. Whereas you would be pleased to see that in the chapter the words are headed are cultural and educational rights, and that minority rights as such should not find a place in this section. Now, if we read clause 2, it would appear that the minorities has been given a certain definite rights in this clause, whereas national interest requires no majority also should be discriminated in this matter. Unfortunately, there is some matters a tendency that minorities as such possess and are given certain special rights which are denied to others. It was the habit of the English masters that they wanted to create discrimination of this sort between a minority and a majority. Sometimes the minority said that they were discriminated against, and on other occasions the majority felt the same. This amendment brings the majority and the minority on an equal status. Specific amendments to the contrary were suggested by members making minorities the sole focus of this article, was rejected. One by Begum Izaz Rasool is illustrative. She argued, any minority residing in the territory of India or any part thereof having a distinct language and script shall be benefited to have primary education imposed to its children through the medium of language and script. So my amendment speaks for itself. After hearing Mr. Leary, I do not think it is necessary for me to go into the details. The word minority has been defined in the draft constitution. I think it is necessary that minorities have a distinct language and a script and should have a right guaranteed to them by the state, and the children of these minorities will have the facilities provided to them to have the primary education imparted to them in their motherling. Equally, an amendment that made it appear that minorities were per se antithetical to the unity of the country was also rejected. Loknath Mishra sought to preface the article with the word, without detriment to the spiritual heritage and the cultural unity of India. This was rejected as it was understood that the cultural and educational rights in the interest of promoting diversity would itself be desirable for Indian democracy and not for any particular cultural unity. On assimilation and integration, a key aspect of the Constituent Assembly debates on the subject, especially post-partition, was the need for minority protection to be coupled with assimilation. In the same way as Dr. Ambedkar's statement, K. Santhanam argued, and I quote, and then in clause 3 of this article, it provided that the state gives aid to education, it shall not discriminate against any educational institution on the ground that it is under the management of a minority, whether based on community or language. And this will be particularly applicable to a linguistic minority. In every province, there are islands of these linguistic minorities. First of all, we have to give large linguistic minorities their right to be educated, especially in the primary stages, in their own language. And at the same time, we should not interfere with the historical process of assimilation. These provisions were then consistently debated in court, and subsequent to the entire development of the jurisprudence, in my view, the key inferences have been the following. One, there was a strong minority protection in the Constitution, particularly in the cultural and the educational rights. Two, these rights were available to all, were deemed particularly instrumental for minorities, the preservation of which was crucial for India's diversity. Three, the right to conserve script, language or culture is necessary, but not in a manner that it acts against the creation of a nation. Four, similarly, the right to establish and administer educational institutions would be concomitant with the responsibility to both provide quality education as well as inclusive education in character. The Supreme Court has placed great emphasis on the former aspect, while it has also touched upon the latter. Given this history of strong minority protection, both in Constitution as well as in the pronouncements of the court, it is imperative that minority institutions also became centers of nation building in a manner that is entirely autonomous and not directed by the state in any manner. As Dr. Ambedkar said in the Constituent Assembly, that they must serve the dual purpose reflected in the Constitution in the working of the minority protection provisions of the Constitution, that is, maintenance of the distinctiveness of the community as well as integration with the nation as a whole, which furthered the prospect of assimilation itself. Now, having discussed this, because this really provides the framework for the education as a base, this right got expanded to the extent that all institutions established for this purposes by minority communities provided for a large representation for children of minority communities to be educated there, since education in this process really held the key. How do we now, emanating from this, ensure economic empowerment? I deal with this in two approaches which supplement each other. The first, which is essential, is that there is a need for India to grow and grow uniformly. How does India grow faster? The faster we grow, the faster the benefits percolate to every community. There's a lot of discussion as to what India's growth model is. And over the past 2.5 decades, the growth model significantly has changed. The emphasis on the present growth model is not merely on distribution of existing resources, but is in addition on increased productivity. Increased productivity leads to a further generation of wealth in a society. And it is that generation of wealth which is distributed on the strength of high growth rate and an inclusive purpose, that it percolates and benefits different sections which have otherwise been kept out of the growth process. I think the earlier growth model that we followed post 47 and pre 1991, the growth of productivity was relatively lesser. And our emphasis was really on distribution rather than on wealth generation. I think the post-91 model, and that is why data seems to indicate that the improvement in the economic condition of those who were deprived earlier, whether on social or religious considerations, those segments, their growth process post-1991 has been significantly faster. How do I see the situation today? I see the situation today on the economic front that this is a great opportunity that India in particular has, because as we look around the world, the rest of the world has slowed down. The rest of the world is adversely impacted at some places by a slowdown almost bordering on recession. Commodity prices, oil prices, which provided the strength to those countries to grow, have adversely impacted them. The low oil price, the low mineral price, the low commodity price regime has actually resulted in a transfer of wealth from producing nations to the consuming nations. And to some extent, it is acting to our own advantage. Under these circumstances, even in the midst of a global slowdown, if we manage to grow by, let us say, 7.5%, there is an increasing need that India has a capacity to add another 1% or 2% to this growth rate if the global tailwinds were to substantially become more supportive, if the rain gods were a little kinder to India, and if we were to continue to move on the economic program that governments over the last 25 years and the roadmap that the governments in those 25 years themselves have taken. Will this in itself be enough? The answer is unequivocally no, because growth itself will help to pull up a lot of people who are either below the poverty line or have fully not received the benefits. But that pulling up process itself is not sufficient. And therefore, the Indian economic model goes a little further. The model proceeds on a basis that a high growth rate which leads to a higher economic activity also provides economic resources to the state. And the state must use these resources significantly for poverty alleviation and other developmental schemes so that it can pump up and add to those communities, those groups, those geographical regions where this progress itself has not reached. For instance, if we were to compare the eastern states of India with the western states of India, economic activity in east is a little weaker than that in the west. Similarly, we can trace out certain historically and socially disadvantaged groups where the need to help them to get out of adverse economic situation needs to be much faster. And therefore, it is equally important that the benefit of this increased resource of the state is to be addressed to those segments where it can benefit. And from the data that I have initially relied upon, certainly there is a need amongst minorities, amongst certain groups, the Muslims in particular, that this advantage of the resource of the state benefits them in more than one ways. Now, I'll broadly deal with some of the suggestions which I have in my mind. For example, last year, we realized that the capacity of the state, both in the government sector as also the private sector, to provide employment to all in a largely populated country is increasingly difficult. And therefore, the institution of people employing themselves and generating self-employment with capital must come up. We launched what is called the Mudra scheme. And I found that this is absolutely spectacular, because in the first year itself, the year is still not complete, over 2 crore new entrepreneurs have got these loans to start their own businesses. So artisans, craftsmen, many others have a huge benefit, and data has shown that most of these loans have been taken by either women or other disadvantaged sections of society, because they are the ones who were erstwhile being, either they were denied capital or capital was available at very exploitative rates, and therefore now being available at the banking rates is a great facility. The other facility it provides to them is that there is no collateral or security which is asked for. So you can get a reasonable amount of loan to start a business or any art, craft or trade that you are involved in. And we've seen that a large number of people, as the data would indicate, I'll just take you through the data, would indicate that large number of women, members of minority communities, people belonging to backward communities, etc., are the real beneficiaries of a scheme of this kind. So this year I have decided to roll it over with 50% more funds being made available. Last year the total amount of funds available was 1,22,000 crores. And this year it's going to be over 1,80,000 crores, which is essentially to be pumped into this sector so that people can take these at reasonable rates and therefore be allowed to grow itself. Now, these are the kind of schemes which could be of extreme importance itself. I am not dealing with the usual facts which most of us are aware of, some positive facts which was announced during the last government itself, the Prime Minister's 15-point program. But I would just, on this question of availability of credit, which is a general concept, availability to all, but how did this work out in the context of the minorities itself? The Reserve Bank of India mandated all scheduled banks to lend 40% of their advances to the priority sector. Government advised the public sector banks to extend 15% of these total priority sector to minorities. The public sector banks achieved this target, and as on 31st of December 2015, 1.35 crore accounts were opened and more than 2.8 lakh crores was lent to the minorities. Now that we are in March end, this figure would have increased. During 2014-15, the lending to the minorities was to the tune of about 2.69 lakh crores, which was about 15.84% of the total amount which was lent. In order to ensure improved financial services for the welfare of the minorities, the RBI then advised all scheduled commercial banking institutions to ensure that the minorities secure fair and adequate measures of benefit flowing out of the government's sponsored various credit programs itself. The Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, which was launched on the 8th of April 2015, with the objective to fund the unfunded, because these self-entrepreneurs were the unfunded section of India's society. In fact, figures indicated that structured large industry in India gave employment to about 2 crore people, and about 11 crore were those who were in the informal sector who had given themselves an employment. And therefore, this was an unfunded sector which required to be funded. As on 22nd of March 2016, which is as of yesterday, under the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, 38,63,861 accounts of minority community were opened, and a total amount of 15,172 crore had been sanctioned to them. Now, this scheme, as I indicated, is going to be rolled over. And therefore, this is an area in which a large number of people belonging to the community itself have a potential to hugely benefit from the potential as far as this scheme is concerned. In terms of educational empowerment, I think the schemes which have been run by the government for some years, the pre-matric scholarship for minorities, the post-matric scholarship for minorities, the merit cum means scholarship for professional and technical courses, the free coaching and allied schemes, etc., the interest subsidy on the loans which are taken, the Maulana Azad, the National Fellowship for Minority Students, these have all continued. And I have the data which I'm glad to share with you, that this year, in the current budget, the amount now is about sanction for all this is 25% higher than it was in the 2014-15 budget itself. So the gradual increase which has taken place because of availability of higher taxation revenues with the government itself has significantly improved. I am, in addition, also conscious of the fact that schemes for skilled development, because this is one area in which a large amount of aptitude has been displayed historically. And some of these skills which are in different regions, which are of different kind, I think the preservation of these skills, the conversion of these skills into an economic opportunity, and the further training of generation after generation, because some of these skills are for the larger benefit of the society itself, and therefore their preservation itself is extremely important. I have finally two important thoughts to share in this regard. The first, and which is really in the context of what happens, and this is an idea that crossed my mind a few weeks ago. I came across a few weeks ago, I came across a particular report in the context of West Bengal, which was released. And I am only treating this as an illustrative example because this actually makes us aware of a lot of challenges. Now, the report is titled Living Realities of the Muslims in West Bengal. Now, when I cited all this, when I came across some of the data, that the data itself appeared to be give some in a state which has a very large minority population, give a detailed analysis of the living conditions which appeared to be extremely inadequate. Now, a state which has otherwise seen political stability, when I went through this entire data, and it's a report which Dr. Amartya Sen released in February 2016, why is it that in a state like West Bengal, which had otherwise seen political stability since independence, except for that brief period between 1967 and 71, and which had a sizable minority population, the data should indicate a figure of living conditions which are far less than even inadequate. And one of the reasons that struck my mind was that is it because in terms of growth of the economy, the state followed a model where growth levels were not fast enough? And I think it's a question, and as I conclude this, it's a question which we must discuss to ourselves, that even though you had a large population and political stability, the growth rates were not adequate because the structural economic model which was followed was a structural model which did not ensure high growth rates. And West Bengal even today continues to be a revenue deficit state, despite being a major state. And therefore, that is really reflected in the fact that whereas post-1991 in most parts of the country, the economic condition of most communities improved, some faster than others. But why is it that a report like this indicated something which was reasonably adverse? And lastly, I cannot conclude without referring to one obvious fact. Today we are passing through a phase where I indicated that our own growth levels are significantly increasing. We have a potential to add to this. We have a potential to have additional resources at our disposal, so that in terms of education, in terms of skill development, in terms of special assistances, wherever there are holes and gaps, the same can be filled up in relation to any particular minority if you are to add to its improvement of its growth level. We also have a fair share of our policy diversions. And when I speak in terms of policy diversion, it's true we are a functional and a live functional democracy. We are also a reasonably noisy democracy. And therefore, whereas the principal agenda really has to be to ensure the welfare of all, diversions do come up, and some of them are extremely unpleasant diversions. And I think the maturity of Indian society would be its ability to ignore these diversions which come up from, which take us into a path where we can ensure a harmonious relationship in the society and a growth process which benefits the all. The extent of maturity we are able to display in marginalizing these kind of policy diversions, I think would eventually determine the environment which we can create for a more prosperous India and an India in which every segment of the society itself gets an opportunity to grow. I thank you very much, sir, once again for the opportunity.